energy transition, shifting focus to demand pull decarbonization. As you've been following closely, the energy transition has been making significant progress, predominantly dominated by supply and technology-led strategies and policies. Renewable energy sources like solar, wind, and hydro are experiencing significant growth, and you have emerging technologies like hydrogen, renewable natural gas, and CCUS making some progress as well, including energy storage systems. But the supply-led investment mainly focus on the creation of new infrastructure, but there are significant challenges in adoption and integration across industries. And that's what today's webinar is about, the need to make a shift to demand pull strategies. Let's begin with some introductions. I'm Sagar Kanchellam. I lead the Energy Transition Advisory Group for WSP Canada, based out of Toronto. I'll pass it on to my colleagues on this presentation. Frederick.
Yeah, my name is Frederick Magnusson. I work for WSP in Sweden, where I head the Strategic Infrastructure Advisory Department. So work quite a lot with supporting our clients with strategic questions in energy and transport. And Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris Postma. I work out of the Kansas City area in the US. I am with WSP's Power and Energy Advisory Services Group and have been primarily focused on the transmission system.
Thank you, Chris and Frederick. As you can see from today's topic and agenda, we'll walk through the context, provide some comparisons between supply led versus demand pull, look at some considerations, and the most important, we'll go through some, three case studies that three of us will dwell in more details and provide some key takeaways and open for any questions that you might have. Please provide your questions in the chat that is available through this platform. Let's look at what's the context, what's driving the demand pull strategies that we're going to talk about. When you look at the global investments in 2024, the clean energy investments were almost double the investments in fossil fuels. The growth rates show rapid progress in clean energy investments and the gradual decline in fossil fuel investments. As you can see from the chart, the clean energy investments at 2 trillion were close to double the fossil fuel investments. But despite these significant investments in clean energy, there is a net increase of energy-related carbon emissions and are at an all-time high. You can see from this chart, some of the clean energy investments have suppressed the growth in emissions, but still there is a net emission increase. And this is driven by the growing demand for energy, with the electricity demand far exceeding the GDP growth. GDP growth is at 3.2%, and you see the electricity demand growing at 4.3%, which is good. It could be led by the electrifications, but it needs to be the clean energy source of electrification. And when you look at some of the high-emitting sectors, when you look at transportation, industry, and buildings, we are falling short in our decarbonization efforts, assuming that we still want to meet some of our 2030 targets when it comes to emissions reductions. That is what it tells me, that we need to do more than what we are doing and exploring other strategies, hence the need for demand pull strategies. Before I get into a little more details on why the need for the shift, let's look at, let's have some brief definition. When we talk about supply-led strategies, these essentially focus on increasing the availability of low carbon solutions. As we talked earlier about the renewable power solutions, the hydrogen solutions. There are policies towards incenting more infrastructure build. When we're talking about demand pull strategies, here the focus is on creating demand for low carbon solutions. And that's where we see the policies and the strategies are need to be enhanced further. Why the need for the shift? And I think we've seen from the chart, it is very evident that progress is not adequate. And it is also fair to say that the supply side efforts can only go so far without demand from consumers, businesses, or industries. There is insufficient focus on the demand reduction side. Sometimes we have over expectations of these emerging technologies like hydrogen and others, which have less history, and they are challenged currently with offtake agreements. We fail to account for some of the broader structural changes that are required across the energy value system. For example, all the enabling infrastructure that is required. And we are falling short on removing some of the socioeconomic barriers and moving slow on some of the regulatory issues as well. Finally, the need is so significant that the scale of change required is enormous. While we need to grow the supply-led strategies, still we need to complement them with the demand pull strategies. As you can see from this slide, a strong demand incentivizes investments. When you focusing on demand pull strategies, they are definitely very strong market signals for the decarbonization and why the need exists. And when you also focusing on demand pull, there is a scale up of technologies possible by making them more commercially viable. And when there is clear market demand, there is significant industry collaborations, you'll start seeing strategies and policies from the governments tuned towards enhancing the market demand. And finally, I think what it does, it encourages consumer behavioral changes as well. So how do we go about this demand pull strategies? I think there are a couple of ways to first start off with. The first thing is you identify your options. What are my options? If I'm a high energy consumer, high emitter, I look at what are my clean energy options, and then I look at how do I go about evaluating options and I can implement them. So here is one way of identifying the decarbonization ways is you're going in a very structured way. First, let me look at how I can reduce my current consumption through efficiency programs. Then I will look at, can I electrify, assuming my the source of electricity is from clean sources. Start electrifying, and these could be mobility or heating sources. Then I look at, can I start substituting some of my high carbon energy fuels and technologies with some of the low carbon fuels and technologies? These could be some of the renewable power, and it could be for process heat. You might be looking at RNG or the hydrogen. You could be also looking at substituting feedstock with the low energy. And even if this doesn't meet your objectives or emissions reductions targets, then you start looking at how can I capture the residue emissions. This could be CCS technologies or direct air capture technologies as well. Even if you are not meeting your objectives after the capturing, then you can go and get some offsets to look at mitigate some of the residue emissions. That's one way of looking at demand. And how do you go about evaluating these various options? At WSP, we have a framework which we call it as INSPIRE. It is a very customized framework, a multi-criteria framework that goes beyond looking at the traditional financial metrics. This framework incorporates the economic impact to the region, the sustainability factors, and looking at various risks, identifies and evaluates all the options that we discussed in the earlier slide. And then through an iterative process using qualitative and quantitative analysis, we go about assessing the options on individual and multiple factors. Very straightforward. You identify the options and you evaluate them on a multi-criteria framework. I think this will become more evident as we discuss some of the case studies today. I'll start off with decarbonization of mining operations, and my colleagues will talk about the other two case studies as well. For the first one, let just give me again to give some context here. It is very interesting when you look at the mining sector in the energy transition side. Most of the clean energy technologies require critical minerals. And to mine critical minerals, you need significant energy consumption. So it has to be clean energy. Otherwise, I think that's why I call it a sustainability paradox. Here is you need clean energy technologies, critical minerals. Mining critical minerals requires more energy. So we better ensure that energy has less emissions. And all these critical minerals, when you look at some of the emissions from these minerals, the average emissions intensity for production is high. So there is a strong need to mitigate this upward pressure on emissions from mineral production. So the case study I'm referring to, this is mining operations in Eastern Canada, and their energy needs both for thermal and power are currently met by, it's a remote areas met by diesel. And that's the choice. And like any remote communities and remote mining centers, that's what you use. What the client's requirement was to meet some of their targets for 2030 and beyond. We're engaged to look at alternative options. We looked at 8 different technologies. Biomass, tidal. Also, we looked at nuclear, SMR. We looked at biofuel, solar, hydro, wind, and even transmission distribution from far-off clean energy sources as well. And what we've done used some of the frameworks I discussed earlier, and went about in a very structured way of looking at what are their energy needs, forecast for the life of the mine and beyond. Looked at the 8 technologies, looked at the execution plans, estimated the capital and life cycle operating costs, looked at the GHG emissions over the life of the mine and beyond, and looked at the traditional financial modeling, incorporated some of the carbon attributes as well. We also looked at the socioeconomic aspects of developing some of the nearby communities, indigenous communities, probably after the mine closes. Maybe there is value of these energy systems being transferred over to the indigenous communities as well. We used our INSPIRE multi-criteria framework assessment to come up with some recommendations. Finally, the outcomes were we had a series of activities through various workshops, qualitative and quantitative assessments, and using the INSPIRE MCA framework, we evaluated on various criteria, sub-criteria with some various measures, had several workshops using the scoring and weighting so that we could provide them with the ranked alternatives. And we did some various sensitivities here. So it is evident, this is a good example from a demand pull strategy. We were not pushing any particular technology. We were technology agnostic, evaluated from a demand perspective, and looked at how can we look at reducing the emissions at the mining operations. Hope it gives you some context on one of the ways sectors that could use from a demand pull strategies. Maybe now I'll pass it on to Chris to talk about the data centers.
Okay, thanks, Sakar. Well, generally about data centers, sort of the lay of the land right now and then make reference to some of the...
Chris, can you speak up? Can't you hear?
Hopefully that's coming through now.
Yes.
So we'll talk generally about data centers, the lay of the land right now, and then a specific approach that we're taking a look at within WSP right now. So Sagar, if you can go on to the next slide. This is becoming a bit of a critical issue really globally right now, but focused into the United States. Data centers, especially the newest generation of them, are falling under what is being classified as large load interconnections. This definition is a very new definition within the US and is varying significantly regionally. In some areas, it's an aggregate load connecting to one or more points of interconnection that exceeds 10 megawatts. Other regions, it's 25 megawatts within ERCOT, which is especially sensitive because in essence, it is a large islanded system with limited connections to the neighboring interconnects. ERCOT is requiring registration for any single aggregate loads that are exceeding 75 megawatts. A lot of the modern data centers, the hyperscalers are looking at projects in either the hundreds of megawatts or the thousands of megawatts right now. Just load growth projections alone within the lower 48 states, the contiguous US, they had previously seen a peak demand, coincident demand across all three interconnects, Eastern, Western, ERCOT, of 745 gigawatt hours last July. There are forecasts for that to grow by 16% by 2029 with data center load and other large loads of those types driving a significant amount of that. And then with the impact of manufacturing, other electrification, addition of heat pumps, adoption of electric vehicles, representing a little under half of that, or a third of the minimum projection for data center growth. So that's sort of putting into context the scale at which this load growth is being driven by data centers. So if we can jump to the next slide, we can also highlight that data center loads and some of these other large loads are very localized impacts, whereas electric vehicle adoption, heat pumps, other forms of electrification happening at the building residential level are more of a global impact. And as we saw, relative to the last 2 decades, load growth has been relatively flat. We have been improving energy efficiency at the same rate of electrification. We've gotten things about as efficient as we can within the household. And so now we're looking at significant jumps. And then this is being magnified by some of the concentrated jumps that are coming from things like data centers. Certainly you can see the very significant bar up there in Northern Virginia that's referred to as Data Center Alley, which we'll talk a little bit more about as this became a recent incident review up at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation level. But you can see concentrations of these coming up. If you overlap that last map with this map, you can kind of see where the power for all of these data centers may be coming from. Certainly at the FERC level within the US, there is a recommendation that these large load customers come to grid interconnections with the ability to supply their own power. Where that's not feasible, you are relying on whatever the local generation resource is. This generation mix varies. Demonstrated right here in this figure. This is information from the Energy Information Administration. This is circa about 2020 and is giving a representation of the different generation resources scaled by size and by fuel type across the country. 95% of the generation currently seeking interconnection, this is demonstrating the operational power, 95% of what is seeking to interconnect right now is renewable, with the vast majority of the remainder being natural gas fueled generation. Due to the significant growths in demand and due to some of the fundamental mismatch in timelines between when you can bring on new generation sources, when you can expand transmission capacity, and the 18 months or less that a data center can be stood up, that is triggering a need for bringing out of retirement or delaying retirement for coal plants across the country, another significant source of emissions, and also nuclear energy. There's already talks to bring 3 Mile Island out of mothballs, modernize it, and get that power back available to the grid. Within some regions, there are already projected shortfalls due to this discontinuity in timelines hitting the country as early as 2027. So there is just that fundamental mismatch between the pace at which demand is growing and the pace at which supply can be brought online and connected to that demand. If we can go to the next slide. One thing to highlight is sort of the methodology that we're looking at when we consider what is the impact of a large load interconnection. I'm coming from the background of a transmission planner, so I'm familiar with looking at the grid, looking at interconnecting generation, interconnecting load, what is going to be the reliability impact of this, what generation is going to be dispatched in order to supply this, while honoring all of the existing transmission services that have already been designated for the grid, because we have a limited amount of capacity. Some of that's already spoken for, and this pace is outpacing, or the pace of demand increase is outpacing the availability of capacity of the system. So a lot of this starts with the interconnection application for large loads. There are different regions that require defining some pretty nuanced characteristics. Ramp rate, size, scaling, your protection systems, operating systems of any behind the meter resources that you might have. You can take a look at this from a series or a serial, looking at each sequential received load interconnection. And with some of that clustering, as I pointed out with Data Center Alley previously, this represents dozens of different customers that have interconnected. So you can take a look at that on a one-by-one basis or lump them all together. We've recently taken a look at about 3.2 gigawatts worth of data center load, all seeking to interconnect into a very localized region, and that has a significant impact when you compare to the load of a city. Austin, Texas, has a load demand of about 1,000 megawatts, 1 gigawatt. This is already just the data centers alone, more than 3 times the size of a developed major city. Same with generation dispatch. The generation that you are powering these new loads with is dependent on what's available in the area and what can make it to the point of interconnection where the data center is connecting. We already talked about the capacity limitations. If you have a resource over here and you have a load demand over here, then the network connecting those two needs to be sufficient in order to meet that demand. We'll talk in the next slide about some of the stability impacts that this is having on system reliability at the same time. But there's also a significant discussion about network upgrade costs relative to stranded assets. This varies very significantly regionally because of the risk of a data center developer, especially if this is a large, well-funded entity that is pursuing multiple projects across different regions. If they aren't happy with the operating landscape, maybe 2 years in, after they've spun up their services, they have the ability to pull out. They have already seen the utility upgrade their system to support this new load, and now relative to the utility's costs, those are potentially stranded assets. There's also just negotiating through interconnection service, power purchase agreements to provide this support. Economic impacts, how is all this funded, and then decarbonization impacts. Where you're bringing all this on, you're potentially delaying retirement for coal plants. How is this going to have an impact on the overall carbon footprint in a region and of these specific data centers? So if you can go to the next slide, this is an example of an event that happened in Data Center Alley. And where you're talking about right now, this is from last summer. This is 60 roughly different data centers that all removed themselves from the grid, went on to internal power supplies all at once in response to a fault scenario that is cleared from the system following normal protection operations. This is a challenge for system operators in order to maintain balance between supply and demand, where they don't have visibility of what these data centers are doing, and that's essentially a challenge for the modern day. This is 1,500 megawatts. We were just talking about the study that we're doing for more than double that. You can go on to the next slide. I will try to wrap it up and pass it on to Frederick, but essentially the big point is the scale at which all of this is changing right now. There's change on the generation front, on the transmission expansion front, and on the rate at which demand is increasing. That makes for a very hairy situation, and one that we're all working on better developing. There's challenges with cost allocation, significant concerns with shifting of data center locations and the risk for stranded assets. Again, grid reliability issues, and how do you risk or balance this risk and the impact that generation resources and availability and adequacy are having on the system. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it on to Frederick.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. We will shift focus a bit, and we will talk about metal production, and we will specifically look at a Swedish example that we have been working with, helping one of our clients on their transition journey and exploring ways to substitute high carbon fuels to more local carbon alternatives. But let's start with looking at the overall market in Sweden, and especially in terms of ore and metal producers. We see that Sweden is quite a big producer of metals, and we produce roughly 84 million tons of ore annually, most of which is refined in Sweden. And this is an industry that's traditionally been quite heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and quite a lot of the Swedish emissions is based on this industry. So just the steel industry alone, for example, represents 6.2 million tons of emissions annually, which is roughly 12% of Swedish total emissions. So this is an industry that needs to change. So if we jump onto the next slide, we can see that in the recent years, we've seen, if you jump back one slide, we see that there's a quite significant external pressure to push the Swedish metal producers to transform into more low carbon technologies. We said that both from a national, European, and also a global perspective, more ambitious climate policy have direct impacts on metal production. So, for example, in the EU, we have something called the EU ETS, the emission trading system, which actually put a price on emissions. And this is something that has a direct impact on the profitability of metal producers, for example, which is high emitters. But we also see that there is a indirect pressure from customers that seeks to transform their supply chain, so they require more sustainable, high quality metals in their processes, which is also something that impacts, of course, the metal producers that needs to comply with those customer demands. So from both perspectives, we see that there's quite significant business rationale to transition into more low carbon alternatives. So this is, of course, something that both, like in terms of the direct impact and indirect impact, pushes producers to transform to more sustainable alternatives. And if you jump to the next slide, we can see that this is something also that we see that the market is responding to. This is just some of the examples in terms of metal production that we see clear market response from, in terms of announcements of significant projects that is ongoing in Sweden right now. And this is quite big one. Perhaps you've heard of H2 Green Steel, for example. They now called Stegra, which is one of the examples. We also see SSAB, which is a large steel producer, and also some of new some of technology development going on here. But the main shift seems to be in Sweden right now, seems to be with hydrogen and electric furnaces for these types of applications. Moving on into the specific case that we are going to look at today. This is a case where we had a client that is a metals producer, quite large metal producers, that has a tradition of fossil fuel operations using coal and oil in their production, with the corresponding very large climate footprint, of course. They identify that, of course, the regulations and what I talked about, both the direct and indirect impact of those will necessitate them to consider decarbonization options to meet both targets 2030, but also moving forward into more stricter policies towards 2050, basically. But this is, of course, something that needs to be done in parallel with keeping or having minimal impact on both operations and product quality, of course, but also from a business perspective, this is something that needs to be sustainable to keep a profitable business. But the need for change is so overwhelming that this is something that they need to pursue, basically. So looking at how we went about and helping our client with this, we utilized a quite structured process to help the client, guide the client through this process, starting with mapping out the current and target states, where we basically needed to understand what is the current situation, what are they using, and the quantities of what they're using today, and assessing also setting the clear ambition and target state in terms of different dates, different years in that process. The next step was to do a thorough technology screening into, like, exploring what alternatives is there for this specific type of metal production, exploring alternatives, and also mapping out what are the feasible technical options that this specific client could use. Further, like, was a very, like, of course, very important in every aspect of this type of like large transition. You need to look at the viability of this. You need to explore the business case. So and how attractive are the different options, both in terms of sustainability performance, because the target is to have a more sustainable production to meet the set like climate ambitions and set sustainability strategies, but also from a financial perspective, because you want to be able to have a profitable business, but also a price level of your end product that meets that the market can accept. And the second thing here is, of course, all transitions and all options are associated with different types of risks. So you need to explore what type of risks are associated with this different types of transitions. And this together, so the technical feasibility, the financial and sustainability performance, and also the risk profile of each of these options were explored into a selection process where we explored what pathways is most suitable to pursue, basically understanding their options. So we explored a couple of different alternatives in this, and also develop execution plans. So helping the client understand what's needed when, and develop that clear execution plan to go about this process. And as an example, like one of the pathways that was explored, if you jump to the next slide, was this specific one. So basically making a quite big shift in 2030, going from like oil and coal production methods into a combination of biogas, natural gas, and hydrogen, and also continue shifting out those fossil fuels into a more and more hydrogen pipeline, just to keep offsetting carbon emissions over time, as you can see in the graph below. So this is one of the options, which was one of the recommended ones for this specific client. So to summarize, what we did was we helped the client gain a better understanding of the current situation and the pathways forward. We helped them understand the business impact of their different alternatives on the market, and helped them make data-driven decisions on where to go from here, basically. And finally, of course, understanding what's needed to be done and when they should do different shifts in their production line. So that's an overview of this specific case. And then I will hand over to Sagar again.
Thank you, Frederick. I'll get my camera working again. Yeah, I think just to wrap up the webinar, and probably we'll get to some few questions at least. The key enablers for demand pull needs to essentially be around policy, system thinking, and behavioral change that we discussed. Hopefully through the case studies and an overview of demand pull strategies, you were able to understand why the need to work and on the supply side strategies. And the key takeaway is that we need a combination of both strategies. But right now, the policies and strategies seem to be more skewed towards a supply push rather than the demand-led strategies. We had some questions coming by. We'll get to a few of them. But what we'll try to do is, just considering the time that we have is only 5 minutes, probably Frederick and Chris, do you guys want to come on video as well? And we can take some questions which are there in the chat. Okay, the first one I'm reading here, and I can take this, Chris and Frederick. How can hydrogen power generation contribution to decarbonization efforts worldwide? Yeah, definitely hydrogen needs to be in the mix of the solutions here. And this is a good example of significant focus on the supply side but now we need the demand side. Hydrogen is a good solution for some of the hard to abate sectors, and that's where we'll start seeing whenever there is some long duration storage, like in the heavy transportation side or in the mining and metals, and the case study that Frederick has commented as well. But the current challenges is really around the offtake agreements, and that's why I think it is important to have these hard to abate sectors be motivated to switch to hydrogen.
Also in data centers, they're already exploring co-firing with hydrogen blended fuels as well. So there's opportunities across the board. It's just developing the infrastructure in order to support this.
Yeah. The next question I'll read out, Chris. Probably you could respond here. Any experience with large-scale batteries for enabling data center interconnection?
Yeah, there's a couple different use cases. One would be using batteries so that you can help mitigate risk of like load rejection or better control load ramps that are associated with data centers. Another use would be demand response. If you have a charged battery and you're hitting peak demand periods, you can have your data center operate off of the stored energy. However, you need to make sure that you can charge up those batteries while also balancing out the demand of the rest of the data center.
Quickly, Frederick, can you comment on the hydrogen? Going back to the earlier questions, was there in terms of in the Nordic region the prevalence of hydrogen as a solution being discussed for the metal sector?
Yeah, no, as like for the one that was managed to read quickly in terms of the slide that I presented there, we saw that there was a combination of different fuel sources in that specific case, for example, and hydrogen is very prominent in terms of the transition of the metal industry, both steel production, iron production, and other types of metal production as well. But what we saw there was that there is both a direct like hydrogen supply, but also a pipeline supply that's for that specific example. But that's only one of the pathways that was explored for this specific example. But hydrogen has a very central role, I would say, in transforming metal production, at least from what we see in Sweden.
Yeah, if the audience is okay for a couple of minutes, we'll try to rush through these questions, but we'll try to respond via emails as well. The next question is the energy investments and energy transition. I think this relates to some of the graphs that me and Frederick have shared in terms of the stats. We'll definitely share the deck with the audience. You can see the source of the information related to the capital commitments or versus actual capital deployed. We'll provide the source for that. And going down. This relates to why these strategies often require significant upfront investment, long-term policy certainty, and sustained government interest to succeed. So a couple of ways to think about, and I think there's another question related to the current geopolitical situation as well, why these kind of strategies are very vulnerable. I think this kind of makes the more the case for why we need a good pull from the demand. If we are focusing a lot of policies towards technology-led or the supply-led, and that's when we're seeing some of the vulnerabilities of some of these policies where they could pull back some of the incentive programs. But when there is a big demand to adopt, I think that's when you start seeing some of the policies becoming more sustainable. And to the question of why do they require significant investments, I think we should recognize is that most of the emerging technologies are very nascent stage, or rather the early stages, and what like we've seen in the previous industrial development as well, whatever the technologies was, look at the previous generation of renewable power as well, there were some incentives and policies that supported the growth. Similarly, we see that support is required in the initial years, and then you start scaling up, and when there is more of a demand pull, that's when you start seeing more sustainable and not the need for incentives. Anything you want to add, Frederick, on some of the government policies you're seeing in EU area?
Yeah, like I would say that why this is so important, because you need to make, because of there's these types of transitions are quite capital intensive. It's a lot of money that you need to put in. You also need to have a sustainable long-term commitment in terms of policies and regulations, because if you were to transform, you need to have a payback period over time, I would say. And you need to work on both supply and demand side on this, because if you don't have the demand, you will have supply without any off takers. So, for example, what we have seen in Sweden, for example, we have built out quite a lot of renewables in the past years, but the industry transition hasn't really come to market yet. So the demand side has been lagging a bit, and then we see drop in electricity prices, for example. So that's why they need to work together, the supply and demand. That's one of the important things, and that's something that you need to work with in terms of policy. But I think the long term is the most important, because the capital market needs to know that they can have return on investment over time.
Yeah, thank you, Frederick. I think I'm looking at the time. Probably we should wrap up now here. What we'll endeavor to do to all the attendees is provide the slides, and some of the questions that we were unable to respond, we'll respond separately as well. Thanks again for joining us on this webinar. Please reach out to any of us if you have any further questions, and please join with other WSP Global webinars that you would come across on the social media. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.